Shriver with us. Loren Shriver is a retired colonel in the United States Air Force. He began his career in the U.S. Air Force Academy Prep School in '62 and spent only 49 years in 4 distinct career segments. During his Air Force career, he went on to graduate school, went through pilot training, served as an instructor pilot, a fighter pilot in Vietnam, and then went on to test pilot school and flew several aircraft there, including the F-15. In 1978, he was selected by NASA to become a space shuttle pilot astronaut and flew 3 space shuttle missions. In 1993, at that time, he retired. This is the first attempt to retirement. Loren has been unsuccessful at retirement. This was his first attempt, and retired from the Air Force and completed his service as an astronaut, and then went into civil service with NASA. He worked in operations management positions in the Space Shuttle program and was the Deputy Center Director for Launch and Payload at the Kennedy Space Center. In 2000, he retired again unsuccessfully from NASA and worked in the United Space Alliance. In 2011, he finally got it right and was fully able to retire at that time. So, Loren, come on up.
Thank you, JD. And I didn't even get it right the last time, it turns out. So I'm more busy now than almost any time ever before, if you believe that. But anyway, thanks for inviting me to come today. I always enjoy talking about space and being fortunate enough to fly in space 3 times on the space shuttle. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. I've got a video that covers a lot of my second mission, which was a mission to deploy the Hubble Space Telescope into orbit. And we went to a record altitude for the space shuttle at that time, 330 nautical miles, which is about 385 normal miles down the highway. Quite a good altitude, and you can see a lot from that kind of a height, and the scenery is just fantastic. And a couple things before I start the video. The video runs about 20 minutes, so we want to be sure and get that in. In order to go into space with any kind of satellite or spacecraft or whatever, you've got to have the speed to counteract the pull of gravity. And Earth's gravity is what keeps you in orbit and keeps you from flying off to Mars or wherever else you might be interested in going. All you got to do is build up the right kind of speed and you'll go out there anyway. But to stay in Earth orbit takes, each altitude you pick is a different speed. Typically, the altitudes we flew to in the space shuttle required about 17,500 miles an hour of horizontal speed. And when you're traveling that fast, and the Earth's gravitational pull will just keep your trajectory in a circle around the Earth. The Earth is at the center of it. Gravity is holding you in the orbit, but that speed allows you never to, well, not never, eventually your orbit will decay and you'll re-enter, but it takes a long time. So enough, by 22,300 miles, then you're traveling fast enough to keep up with the Earth's rotation, so you will stay exactly over the same point on the Earth all the time. And that's where all of the TV satellites and the radio satellites, the ones that have transponders that you can get almost any channel you want to hear or see, that's where those satellites are at that altitude. Okay, besides the 17,500 miles an hour, who happened to hit that speed, by the way, driving here today? Anybody? It's pretty fast, but it only takes 8.5 minutes when you've got the 2 booster rockets and then 3 main engines on the back of the shuttle. You'll see that in the video. I'll talk about that a little bit. And then when you finally have main engine cutoff, you're not really in orbit yet. You've got to do another burn. You're coasting up to the high point, which is called apogee, and there's a low point of the orbit that's perigee. Until you do that second burn, perigee is at the surface of the earth. So you don't want to come back that quickly. So it's pretty important to do that next burn using the maneuvering engines. And then, of course, that builds up a lot of energy in the spacecraft. And to come back and re-enter, you have to get rid of all of that energy. And you do that by subtracting a little bit of velocity from the space shuttle, so that gravity now is the predominant force, and it pulls you back down into the atmosphere slowly. But as you encounter the atmosphere coming back in, you create a lot of friction, a lot of heat on the outside of the spacecraft, somewhere around 2,700 degrees Fahrenheit, just between, on the other side of the window pane from where you're sitting. So everybody's hoping that window pane lasts a long time and doesn't fail. And the rest of the spacecraft is insulated as well. Let's go ahead and run the video. This is of my second mission, the Hubble Space Telescope deploy. And it's pretty standard mission sequence as we go through it. This is the crew patch designed by the 5 members of the crew. And we're suiting up now, getting ready to go out. This is me and Charlie Bolden, my pilot. And Steve Hawley, an astronomer, was one of the mission specialists. Bruce McCandless, another mission specialist, and Kathy Sullivan, the 3rd mission specialist. Had a 5-person crew. Bruce and Kathy were the spacewalking pair in case we needed to have them go outside and do any procedure outside. After you suit up and make sure that works, you get in the crew van, go out to the pad, crawl in and lay on your back for about 2 hours and 45 minutes. Orange tank. And then at T0, the boosters fire and off you go. And there are bolts that get explode. The nut on the bolt explodes and releases the spacecraft. You're already going about 300 miles an hour in 100 feet as you clear the top of the pad. So those are pretty hefty boosters that supply the thrust. The solid fuel boosters on the side, the white ones, that's solid fuel inside of there. It has oxidizer and fuel mixed together. If you were to poke on it, it feels like the eraser of a number 2 pencil, basically. And you don't want to push on it too hard or crack it, because then it might not work very well. I mentioned that the entire ascent up to get you up to about 17,500 miles an hour is only about 8.5 minutes. And then this is the view that greets you at 385 miles when you look out the window the first time, finally get a chance to do that. You can see now that we're checking out some things on the space shuttle, making sure that all the systems there work properly. This mechanical arm built in Canada was pretty critical to our operation to lift the telescope up out of the payload bay and activate it with commands that we sent, and some from the ground also. We didn't do all of it ourselves. But Steve Hawley was the astronomer guy. He was the operator of the arm, and he was checking out the arm. This is day 1 after the launch, and we're in orbit. Now we're doing all these things to get ready. Bruce was one of the spacewalking people, EVA we call it. He's checking out this pretty exotic torque wrench, and it's battery operated. Notice the weightlessness, 0G. Really handy when you're on orbit. Push the battery into the control box, and then you'll see him turn it on, and it rotates. Real fancy machine, probably costs several $100,000, but it limits the torque feedback to the spacewalking person, so that when you put it on a nut and try to undo the nut, the astronaut doesn't go whizzing around and around, puts more torque into the nut. Bruce and Charlie Bolden are checking out more equipment on the first day. And you'll see Kathy Sullivan, the airlock where she is. She's floating out of there. And you'll notice that she's checking her checklist. Everything you do on orbit in a spacecraft is done by checklist. If you don't do that, you will screw something up. And your name will be mud for quite a while after that. So everybody is very conscious about that. She's checking out the spacesuits that are inside where her feet were pointed. A task that needs to be done and successful. Okay, now we're on the morning of our second day in space, and instead of checking out the equipment, now we've got a hold of the telescope. There's a special fixture on it. Steve Hawley has maneuvered the arm over to grab a hold of the telescope right down in that area. Notice the deserts of Africa, the payload bay. My job was to operate the space shuttle and keep it going where it was going and oriented the way it was supposed to be. And Charlie, Bolden, and Steve were responsible for lifting that telescope up out of the payload bay. It's a big telescope. It's like 45 feet long, 13 feet in diameter. It weighs about 24,000 pounds. So it's a sizable telescope, and it's still up there operating today, by the way, 31 years after we deployed it in April of 1990. It's been revisited 5 times, so to upgrade a bunch of things on board the telescope. I get the question from school kids, well, where does the observer sit on the telescope? I said, well, in Greenbelt, Maryland, as a matter of fact. Steve is still working on getting the telescope up out of the payload bay. You can see he's got it up way above the payload bay now, and we're about to start checking it out and sending it commands to get ready to release it. High gain antenna, the little bowl-shaped thing. There are 2 of those, one on the other side, and solar array, the gold thing there, 2 of those on opposite sides as well. All those things had to be deployed to make it an operable telescope. The big barn door over the end of the telescope was to keep dirt and stuff like that out of the inside of the telescope to not contaminate the mirror on the inside. And again, going through checkout, you'll see here in a minute the first solar array that we unrolled worked fine. It went both directions simultaneously. We knew that we had to get both solar arrays out, or the telescope would not be able to produce enough electricity to keep the heaters and the equipment going. Okay, this is the first solar array. Notice that it's going both directions at once. And we were watching it to make sure it didn't look like it was buckling or anything like that with too much pressure applied. And again, there's a second one on the opposite side. Here's one of the high gain antennas already deployed. The other one is up in there. The second solar array didn't work properly. We would send it command and it would go about an inch or 2 and then stop. And it's not supposed to do that. It's supposed to keep going. So Bruce and Kathy, after we tried about 4 or 5 times to make it go, it's obvious it wasn't doing right. So they took tools into the airlock, got suited in the spacesuits, and they were going to go reduce the pressure in the airlock down to vacuum and then go outside with those tools and hand crank the solar array all the way open. We practiced that in the water tank at Houston several times. Finally, the ground figured out that it was actually a software problem. Everything is a software problem these days. And they isolated that software, and then we sent a command, and it got deployed to second array. And we were right at the end of the deploy window. So as soon as we got that solar array open, almost immediately, we let go of the telescope and backed away. It was my job to back the space shuttle away from the telescope after Steve Hawley released it from the arm. And by doing that, then you fly up and over the top of the telescope, bring it back in case something wasn't working right. Because the plan was to visit the telescope about every 3 years with another mission to upgrade things like the solar arrays, the science instruments, that sort of thing. And as I say, they did do it 3 times. Okay, I guess I should have warned you that there is a quiz it has 2 questions. The first question of the quiz, which is called, "Where in the world are we?" Where in the world are we in this photograph? South America, that's right. If you visualize, say, Peru and Bolivia and Chile down to the lower left, we are just now, it doesn't look like we're going 17,500 miles an hour, does it? Well, you have to take my word for that. We really are. And we're coming over the coast of, I think Chile, actually, where we are at. You see one of the dry lake beds in the high Andes Mountains there, right along the coastline. And the cloud pattern is very typical of that part of South America for the 5 days that we were up on this mission. And if it looks like we're directly overhead, that is true. We are directly overhead the telescope, and it's flying below us. And then we just keep moving back behind it because without adding some more velocity, that's what happens. We'll just automatically move back down and behind it. We're over Brazil now in this photo. You can probably see that the ground is pretty much dark below us, but we're still illuminated by the sunlight, which is one of those neat features of being in orbit high enough to have something below you already darkness and you still illuminated. It's really neat to get used to that. And then after that was over, that basically we went on to do other experiments that we carried with us. And this is called protein crystal growth. There's several small chambers with a little needle affair stuck into it. And then you formed a little bubble of fluid on the end of it right in there. And perhaps you can see some crystals beginning to form in that fluid. And that was the idea. These are protein crystals. And we brought those back. And the people on the ground then studied those proteins to see what the makeup and the structure was. So that if it's a good protein, then they can duplicate it. If it's a bad protein, they can try to develop something that will counteract it. And this particular experiment flew half a dozen times, really. It was a good deal for the payload specialist. This was a little experiment we carried about its electrostatic arcs, and we oriented this thing different ways as we flew through the Earth's magnetic field, trying to see if there was any change. I never did notice that it changed a lot, so I'm not sure whether those movies really big format that goes into making those movies. Okay, this is easy. This is the second question of the quiz. Where in the world are we? Baja, right. Baja coming down, Gulf of California, west coast of Mexico right there. And in a few seconds, you'll see more of the interior of Mexico. And again, you notice at this altitude, we can't see a lot of detail, but you can tell kind of things that contrast with each other are real easy to see. The 2 white dots up there in the upper center, those are 2 extinct volcanoes just to the southeast of Mexico City And you notice the gray area up to the, up over in here, that's Mexico City. So that's what Mexico City looks like from 385 miles. And again, cloud formation and all that was pretty standard. And you're seeing both coastlines at the same time here. So it's really neat. The scenery just so beautiful. The earth is such a beautiful place when you can see so much of it at any one time. It's great. Now we're back looking east out over Brazil and the Atlantic Ocean out here. Again, the altitude and the cloud formation. It got so after a while, and the weather was very similar. We could tell what continent we were over without looking at the computer. This is a medical experiment. You notice Steve Hawley is kind of wincing there as Kathy Sullivan pushed the equivalent of 8 TB time tests into his arm at one time. And this was all about the body's immune system to see whether or not there were changes in the body's immune system from exposure to weightlessness and that sort of thing. They did this experiment before launch, during the mission, and then again after we landed. This is the day before reentry, after all the primary and secondary experiments were done. We're checking out. This is the great example of the advanced technology we had on. This is a CRT display. This is the best display we had. Remember, this is early mid 80s and early 90s, but the shuttle itself was built in the late 70s. So we're checking out the systems. This is the Earth's atmosphere. You normally think of the atmosphere as being almost endless. Look how thin it is, really. Earth is on the left side, space is on the right side, and the little blue line is the Earth's atmosphere. Not much protection there. So pretty critical to have that around. Earth's atmosphere. Now we're going to go through reentry. It's hard to have a chase plane in the early part because there's no atmosphere to fly in. This is about halfway through reentry, and we are encountering, this is infrared cameras, and the really bright spots are the hot spots. And that comes from all the friction on the outside of the spacecraft. Again, I mentioned about 2,700 degrees on the outside, so it's good to know that you've got good insulation. Again, very hard to have a chase airplane because you're still at, 240, 250,000 feet. This photograph, though, is a regular camera, and the white spot is, or the underside is just sun glint. And we're landing at Edwards Air Force Base in California in this sequence that you'll see now. So the space shuttle is a glider when it's returning. After you do the deorbit burn, there are no other motors or thrusters involved, except early on when you're trying to maintain attitude. And then as soon as you can fly like an airplane, then you fly like a glider. Not a very good glider either. 210, 15,000 pounds and those little stubby wings. Glides kind of like a brick, as a matter of fact. But it does glide, and you dive at the ground you see the end of the runway, you come back, a couple of miles, and you aim at that point, and then when you get about 1,800 feet above the ground level, then you pull the nose up a little bit, and you start slowing down even further, and then the pilot he pushes the button for the landing gear. Single most important thing that the pilot does during the entire mission, in my humble opinion. And then I'm continuing. The last two missions I flew and landed for the landing phase, and you get down close to the runway, you just establish an attitude and let it fly onto the runway. if you start trying to get too fancy, then you actually can drive the gear into the runway, and it doesn't look like a very good landing after that. So we touched down around 205 knots, which is about 225 miles an hour, and slowly lower the nose and then try to get the brakes on, or at least test the brakes. The runway is 15,000 feet long, so we don't have to use that much braking. But your legs, after being several days in zero G, trying to move your legs from resting the heels on the floor up to the brake pedals, which are the top of the rudder pedals, feels like each leg is 100 pounds, and you just, oh, man, this is really something. But motivation is pretty high, and eventually get your feet up there and start applying the brakes and making sure that the brakes work. And then you back off a little bit and let it run out and coast, just not trying to get the brakes too hot or anything like that. And you'll notice that even though the such a picture perfect stop right in line with the tower, and it was all by accident, but I'll take credit for it anyway. After you come to wheel stop, then you start reconfiguring all the switches, get it set up for a ground crew to come in and take over while you unstrap, and then about 45 minutes or so, and you're ready to get out of the spacecraft. You must have put it in slow motion or something. There it is. There's the tower. Is that not perfect or what? No. So the reconfiguration starts, and everybody gets out of the seat inside, and then you're met by a ground crew, and everybody gives you a hug, and then they immediately back away because it's been about 5 days since you had a shower last, and then it's off to the crew quarters and get out of the suit, and then you can take that shower that you've been waiting 5 days to take. I don't know whether we have any more time. Okay, any questions anybody have? Oh boy, let's see. Let's go ahead. Well, we carried up really big payloads in the space shuttle, the Hubble telescope being one of them. A big enough rocket could have done that, but the one thing to remember is the space shuttle was sold by NASA and DoD together, talking to Congress so that they could get the funding. And so all of the big payloads that the DoD has and that NASA had the payload bay size of the shuttle was sized by primarily the DoD payloads that ended up going into it. After all that, then after Challenger happened, President Reagan said, well, we're only going to use the space shuttle for NASA missions. And the DoD went back and developed their next generation of expendable rockets. So usually you could do, most of the missions that we did, except for those missions that had spacewalks on purpose, where we did and built stuff like we assembled the whole space station, for example, that's still up there today, circling. That would have been impossible with an expendable, right? Well, not impossible, would have taken probably 10 times the number of missions to do it. So there were some unique things about some things that where the space shuttle really helped do that a lot. Well, no, the space shuttle has been retired. It flew its last flight in 2011. Discovery is in the Smithsonian. I went back for the 25th anniversary of the launch of the Hubble telescope, and Discovery was on a pedestal in the Udvar-Hazy part of Smithsonian out at Dulles.
How does that work? Or am I wrong about that?
You
I
were
mean,
asking.
Yeah, is it a great relationship and everything works very well, or is it difficult, or?
With the Russians?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know the
It
details of
seems
it,
to
so
run
I'm
hot and
curious.
cold. It seems to run hot and cold from time to time. Mostly, though, in the space business, it's been a pretty good relationship. I can tell you my humble opinion that the Russian human spaceflight program would be almost non-existent today if it weren't for that agreement between them and us, because we kept them alive after 1991 or 89, what the Velvet Revolution, whatever, because they were in bad trouble then for money. So,
Are those tires on the craft when you landed? Did they just throw them away? Are they good for one landing?
they're one landing tires, yeah. Usually you had a little bit of a flat spot where you actually touch down and then rolls up. And if the flat spot got too big and too deep, then, it's a bad day again.
Two quick questions. After the deployment of the Hubble, there was this thing about the lens was not as clear as they.
Spherical aberration.
Yeah. Then that was fixed on
Yeah.
one of those missions later.
On the first servicing mission, they carried up a refrigerated sized instrument that the only thing it did was flip basically a monocle out into the focal point or just before the focal point to get everything focused again.
Right.
And they used that for quite a few number of years. Now the instruments that are on the telescope, each one of them is individually compensated for inside of it for that spherical aberration on the main mirror. Spherical aberration was the big mirror at the back of the telescope. Photons come in the telescope, they hit that mirror, they're reflected up to a secondary mirror up at the front of the telescope, and then back down to the focal point where the images are all picked off by the instruments. Well, at Corning, they ground off on the outer edge of that big mirror, the 3-meter mirror, about too much. They took too much glass off of it to the tune of about pull a hair out of your head, cut it in half, and that's how much too much they ground it. So it's a very, very small error. Come to find out, as they did the investigation after they discovered it, the data actually showed, some of the test data showed that there was this problem, and there was a backup mirror available. But changing out main mirrors in a telescope would have delayed by probably 5 years. I'm just guessing now as to why they didn't do that. Well, I think they blamed it on the test equipment. And that was the major faux pas on the part of the engineering community, is they saw the error a couple of times and they said, oh, it's our test setup. That's what the problem is. When in reality, it turned out to be the mirror.
Last question. What kind of aircraft?
Anything watching us at 200,000
Not
feet.
200,000. Yeah.
We rendezvoused. The first 4 missions, I think, had chase airplanes, and those were T-38s. It's a fighter type trainer aircraft. There are 2 people can sit in it, and they would rendezvous as the space shuttle is coming in, and they make that big circle around the end of the runway to get lined up with the end of the runway. They joined up with the shuttle then, and then they followed it down and watched it land. But no, just normal airplane altitudes for that.
Are there any questions online?
Anyway. Oh.
Yes. No.
I have one. So this has more to do with your personal experience. The first is when you're up in space, I mean, on Earth, because of gravity, we get a center of orientation. When you have zero gravity, how do you have a sense of I'm upside down, I'm sideways,
Well, you don't, except for your eyes. Your inner ear mechanisms are all messed up. They don't work properly. If you close your eyes, you just cut off the last input to your brain as to what's up, down, sideways, whatever. And the only reason you care, I guess, or it really, the best way to put it is it doesn't make any difference what's up, down, or sideways when you're in weightlessness, because your body is reacting the same, whatever orientation it's in. We had little sleeping bags, and you could put the pip pins in various holes. You could put one up above and sleep. By convention, your head is pointed toward the floor and your feet are pointed toward the ceiling. But as soon as you close your eyes, well, it doesn't make any difference with your eyes open or closed. But when you close your eyes, then you do cut off all the input to your brain that says what your orientation is. But the good thing is it doesn't make any difference. You're in weightlessness.
and one last question. So that first time that you were informed that you're going to be flying in space, what was that like?
Oh, well, when I came back, well, while I was in Southeast Asia, Thailand, I applied for the test pilot school, and then went through test pilot school after I got back. And after I did that, wasn't really thinking about it, but because I wanted to do that anyway, but it made me actually eligible to become an astronaut is in NASA's eyes, because all of the astronauts that had been selected prior to that had test piloting background, either from Navy, Army, Air Force, whatever. And after I had been about 2.5 years in the test business, NASA put out its call for applicants for space shuttle astronauts. And so my wife and I talked it over, and we said, okay, yeah, you've worked hard for so far. Why don't you put your name in? I did. I was down to Houston for that interview, and then promptly didn't hear anything from NASA until January 16th of 1978, the following year. And early in the morning, must have been about 6:30 or so, I had a flight on the schedule that was fairly early, and I got up and was in the bathroom getting ready to go to work, and the phone rings. And my wife was still lounging in bed, and she grabs the phone and answered it. And in just a few seconds, she's walking in with the phone. Her arm is fully extended, like this phone is diseased. It had COVID-19 on it or something. And she just wanted to get rid of that phone really bad. And so I took it and said hi. And well, she warned me. She said, "It's George Abbey." George Abbey was the chairman of the selection committee that interviewed every person that they asked down to do an interview. And he, he said, "Hi, how are you doing?" We just exchanged greetings, and then he asked what I thought was probably one of the more dumb questions I've ever had in my life. He said, not exact words, but something to the effect of, "Are you still interested in becoming an astronaut?" And finally, after a couple of seconds, it took me to recover from that question. I said, "Well, yes, George, absolutely, I am. I really am interested." And he said something to the effect that, "Well, that's good because the selection committee has selected you to become a member of the class of 78. So, you know, big change in focus from that point on, you know. The interesting part of the story, I finished getting my flight suit on to go down and fly my mission. And when I walked into the ops building, there was an Air Force enlisted guy. Right, in those days, we were still using grease pencil boards and all that for the schedule. And I walked in to look at the board, and he turned around and said, "Did you get a phone call?" And I said, "You know, enlisted guy talking." And so I did a double check and I said, "Well, yes, I did." "Who from?" And I told him George Abbey, and he just reached across. Excuse me. It's always an emotional story because they had figured out if you got a phone call from George Abbey, it meant you were selected. If you got one from the admin guy who was also on the selection board, that meant, well, try again next time, I guess. But anyway, yeah.
Well, congratulations. Thank you for being with us here today. I'm an Air Force brat. My dad served 29 years. Be a little difficult. But thank you so much. Really appreciate it. What a great program. JD, thank you again. And thank you for really enlightening us. You know, I have to tell you, even as a little girl, I wanted to be an astronaut. Never quite came to fruition, but probably many of us in this room watched man walk on the moon or watched different things of the space program. And we always thought that would be the coolest thing in the world, to be up in space. So thank you for sharing your experiences with us. We really appreciate it.
I always thought it would be cool too, but I thought, you know, little old Iowa farm boy, your chances of doing that are about non-existent. And this goes to show I get a chance to talk to kids quite a bit. And when they get around to asking, well, what did you do to become an astronaut? Then you can launch into 15 minutes worth of, well, try real hard and don't ever look back. And that's basically how it works. So
Well,
it's
thank you very much.